This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history from rural Alabama, where three sisters orchestrated events so horrifying that local authorities buried the records for nearly 8 decades. What happened in the cotton fields outside Millerville in October 1902 defied explanation then, and continues to challenge our understanding of human nature today. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like and join us as we uncover a case that demonstrates how the most disturbing crimes often occur in the most isolated places, far from the watchful eyes of civilization. The autumn of 1902 found Alabama's rural communities struggling through economic hardship following years of poor cotton harvests. Millerville, a settlement of barely 300 souls, nestled between the Tombigbee River and endless stretches of farmland, existed in virtual isolation from the outside world. The nearest railroad station lay 43 miles east through treacherous swampland, and the telegraph line had been damaged by storms that summer, leaving the community effectively cut off from modern communication. Into this isolated world came Reverend Matthias Blackwood, a traveling preacher whose reputation for powerful sermons and miraculous healings had preceded him throughout the region. Reverend Blackwood arrived on October 12, 1902, according to records preserved in the Millerville Methodist Church archives. The 54-year-old minister had spent the previous decade establishing churches across the rural South, building a following among farming communities desperate for spiritual guidance during difficult times. Local newspaper accounts from the Tuscaloosa Herald describe him as an imposing figure, standing over 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes and a commanding voice that could reportedly be heard across an entire cotton field without strain. The Henley sisters, Margaret, aged 28, Catherine, 26, and youngest sister Elizabeth, 24, had been among the most devout members of the temporary congregation that gathered in the abandoned Millerville schoolhouse each evening during Blackwood's 2-week revival. What made the Henley sisters unique in this rural community was their unusual independence. Following the death of their parents in a house fire 3 years earlier, they had successfully maintained their family's 160-acre farm without male assistance, a remarkable achievement that earned them both respect and suspicion from neighbors. Documents from the Choctaw County Land Office show the sisters owned their property outright, having paid off the remaining mortgage through careful management and exceptional cotton yields. Margaret, the eldest, served as the unofficial leader, handling business transactions with the sharp intelligence that had allowed the family to prosper. Catherine possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal plants and served as the community's unofficial healer, while Elizabeth, despite being the youngest, demonstrated an unsettling ability to predict weather patterns and crop yields with uncanny accuracy. The sisters attended every one of Reverend Blackwood's evening services, arriving early and remaining late to discuss theological matters with an intensity that impressed even the seasoned preacher. According to diary entries discovered in 1983 by Dr. Harold Whitmore, professor of Southern History at Auburn University, Blackwood wrote extensively about the sisters' spiritual dedication. The Henley women possess a fervor for divine truth that surpasses any I have encountered in 27 years of ministry, he noted on October 18th. Their questions probe the very foundations of faith itself, reaching into mysteries that most souls fear to contemplate. But Dr. Whitmore's research, conducted between 1981 and 1984, would reveal that the sisters' interest in Reverend Blackwood extended far beyond spiritual matters. Through painstaking examination of surviving correspondence held in private collections throughout Alabama, he discovered that the sisters had been in contact with previous communities where Blackwood had preached, gathering detailed information about his methods, his schedule, and most disturbingly, about young women who had disappeared following his visits to their towns. The pattern that emerged from Dr. Whitmore's investigation painted a horrifying picture. In Meridian, Mississippi, 2 unmarried sisters had vanished 3 days after Blackwood's revival ended. In Selma, Alabama, a young widow had disappeared along with her 15-year-old daughter. Each disappearance had been attributed to families leaving town for better opportunities, a common occurrence during those economically desperate times. But the Henley sisters had somehow connected these seemingly unrelated departures, recognizing a pattern that had escaped local authorities in each affected community. Records from the Alabama Department of Archives and History, specifically from the Jefferson Davis Papers collection, contain a letter dated September 30th, 1902, written by Margaret Henley to her cousin in Mobile. In this correspondence, she refers obliquely to preparations being made for the preacher's arrival and mentions that certain arrangements have been finalized with Catherine's botanical knowledge and Elizabeth's special insights. The letter concludes with the chilling observation that some shepherds devour their flocks, but even wolves may be hunted when the prey becomes the hunter. On the evening of October 24th, 1902, the sisters invited Reverend Blackwood to their farmhouse for a private dinner, ostensibly to discuss establishing a permanent church in Millerville. The invitation was extended publicly following the evening service, witnessed by 17 community members, according to testimony recorded by Sheriff William Morrison 3 days later. The Reverend accepted graciously, expressing particular interest in viewing the sisters' extensive library, which reportedly contained over 300 volumes, an impressive collection for a rural farming family. Contemporary accounts describe the Henley farmhouse as a substantial 2-story structure built of local timber and fieldstone, surrounded by ancient oak trees that created deep shadows even during daylight hours. The house sat approximately 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense woodland. Architectural details preserved in insurance records from the Millerville Mutual Assurance Company indicate the building featured an unusual basement level carved directly into the limestone bedrock, originally designed for food storage but modified by the sisters for unknown purposes. What transpired during that dinner would not be fully understood until decades later, when Dr. Whitmore's investigation uncovered the sisters' meticulous documentation of their actions. Hidden within the walls of the old farmhouse, discovered during demolition work in 1982, were journals written in Catherine's precise handwriting that detailed months of planning and preparation. These documents, now housed in the Auburn University Special Collections Library, reveal that the sisters had spent considerable time studying Blackwood's methods, learning how he selected his victims, and understanding the psychological techniques he employed to gain their trust. The journals describe the sisters' discovery that Blackwood carried a small leather case containing personal items taken from his victims, locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, and disturbing photographs that documented his crimes. More chillingly, they had learned that he used a combination of laudanum and chloral hydrate to incapacitate his victims, drugs that Catherine had obtained through her connections with traveling medicine dealers who regularly passed through the region. But rather than alert authorities to Blackwood's crimes, the sisters had chosen a different path. Catherine's journal entry from October 20th reveals their decision. The law reaches slowly to places like ours, and justice delayed becomes justice denied. We have seen the pattern, understood the method, and prepared the response. What he has done to others he intended for us, but we are not helpless lambs awaiting slaughter. The preparation described in these journals went far beyond simple vigilante justice. Elizabeth's contributions to the planning process demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible for a 24-year-old farm woman to possess. Her detailed understanding of human anatomy, combined with Catherine's botanical expertise and Margaret's organizational skills, created a plan that was both methodical and horrifyingly thorough. On the appointed evening, Reverend Blackwood arrived at the Henley farmhouse, carrying his usual traveling case and wearing his finest black suit. According to the journals, he was received warmly and escorted to the dining room, where an elaborate meal had been prepared, featuring local game and vegetables from the sisters' garden. The conversation reportedly remained pleasant throughout the first 2 courses, with Blackwood discussing his vision for a permanent church, and the sisters asking detailed questions about his past successes in other communities. It was during dessert that the evening's true purpose became apparent. Catherine had prepared a special cake using honey from their own beehives, but she had incorporated something additional into the recipe. The journals describe how she had carefully calculated the dosage needed to incapacitate a man of Blackwood's size without causing immediate unconsciousness. She wanted him alert enough to understand what was happening to him, just as his victims had been aware during their final moments. As the drug took effect, Blackwood's confident demeanor began to change. His speech became slurred, his movements unsteady, and a growing awareness of his predicament showed in his increasingly frightened expressions. Margaret calmly retrieved his leather case from his coat pocket, opening it on the dining table to reveal the gruesome trophies he had collected from at least a dozen victims. Photographs scattered across the white tablecloth showed young women in various states of terror and degradation, while locks of hair tied with ribbons created a macabre display of his predatory career. Elizabeth, whose journal entries suggest she possessed disturbing insights into human psychology, began questioning Blackwood about each victim, using details she had somehow obtained through correspondence with families in affected communities. Her questions were precise and unrelenting, forcing the increasingly helpless preacher to confront the full extent of his crimes. Meanwhile, Catherine prepared additional compounds from her collection of medicinal plants, substances that would prolong his awareness while preventing him from calling for help. The basement level of the farmhouse had been transformed into something that defied description. Dr. Whitmore's notes, discovered among his papers following his mysterious disappearance in 1984, describe finding evidence of modifications that suggested the sisters had created a space specifically designed for what they termed divine judgment. Iron restraints had been anchored into the limestone walls, and Catherine had arranged her botanical preparations on shelves that ran the length of the room. Most disturbing were Elizabeth's contributions, detailed drawings covering the walls that depicted scenes of biblical justice being administered to those who preyed upon the innocent. What happened in that basement over the following 3 days challenged Dr. Whitmore's ability to document objectively. His final notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, describe finding preserved evidence that the sisters had conducted what they believed to be a divine trial, with each serving in a specific role. Margaret acted as judge, presenting evidence of Blackwood's crimes and questioning him about his victims. Catherine served as executioner, using her knowledge of plants and anatomy to inflict punishments that mirrored the suffering he had caused others. Elizabeth assumed the role of prophet, interpreting signs and determining the appropriate duration and intensity of each phase of judgment. The journals indicate that Reverend Blackwood remained conscious for most of the 3-day ordeal, sustained by Catherine's careful administration of stimulants that prevented him from escaping into unconsciousness. The sisters documented his confessions to additional crimes, including details about victims whose disappearances had never been connected to his ministry. They recorded his pleas for mercy and his attempts to bargain for his life, contrasting these with descriptions of how his victims had made similar pleas that went unheeded. By the morning of October 27th, the sisters' work was complete. But rather than simply disposing of Blackwood's remains, they chose to create a message that would serve as both warning and proof. Using Elizabeth's artistic skills and Catherine's knowledge of preservation techniques, they prepared the Reverend's body in a manner that would ensure its discovery, while making clear that this was not a random act of violence, but a calculated response to his crimes. Sheriff Morrison discovered the scene on October 29th, following reports from concerned parishioners who had expected Blackwood to appear for Sunday services. The sheriff's official report, preserved in the Choctaw County Courthouse records, describes finding the basement arranged like a courtroom, with evidence of the preacher's crimes displayed systematically throughout the space. Blackwood's body occupied a central position to suggest divine judgment had been rendered and executed. The physical evidence told a story that horrified even experienced lawmen. Dr. Ezekiel Hampton, the county medical examiner, noted in his report that the condition of the remains suggested prolonged suffering administered by individuals with detailed knowledge of human anatomy and medicinal compounds. More disturbing was the precision evident in every aspect of the scene. This was not the work of amateur vigilantes, but of individuals who had planned and executed their actions with clinical methodology. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in rural Alabama, where 3 sisters committed acts so heinous that the official records were sealed for over 80 years. Before I begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this investigation compelling, as your support helps bring these forgotten cases to light. In the autumn of 1902, the cotton fields of Crenshaw County, Alabama, stretched endlessly under an oppressive sky, broken only by scattered farmhouses and the occasional country church. The Whitmore family had established their homestead there in 1887, carving out a modest living from the red clay soil that stained everything it touched. Benjamin Whitmore, a stern Methodist farmer in his 50s, had raised 4 daughters after his wife's death from consumption in 1895. The 3 eldest sisters, Martha, aged 26, Evangeline, aged 24, and Prudence, aged 22, had remained unmarried well past the typical age, caring for their youngest sister, Rebecca, who was set to wed Pastor Silas Thornfield on November 15th of that year. What happened during those wedding preparations would shock the rural community and leave investigators baffled for generations to come. Pastor Silas Thornfield arrived at the Whitmore farm on November 10th, carrying his worn leather Bible and a small valise containing his ceremonial vestments. The 38-year-old minister had served congregations across 3 counties for over a decade, earning a reputation for his passionate sermons and unwavering moral convictions. According to the wedding announcement preserved in the November 8th edition of the Crenshaw County Herald, the ceremony was to be a simple affair, attended by neighboring families and conducted in the Whitmore family parlor. What the newspaper failed to report was that Pastor Thornfield would never leave that farmhouse alive, and that his disappearance would trigger an investigation revealing practices so disturbing that the local authorities struggled to document them properly. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came on November 16th, when the wedding guests arrived to find the Whitmore house eerily silent. Mrs. Eleanor Chadwick, a neighbor who had brought preserves for the reception, later testified that she could smell something burning from inside the house, though no smoke was visible from the chimney. When the assembled guests knocked repeatedly without response, 3 men broke down the front door to discover a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The parlor had been arranged for the wedding ceremony, with chairs positioned in neat rows and wildflowers arranged in mason jars along the windowsills. But the flowers had withered to black husks, and the wooden floors bore strange circular stains that seemed to pulse with an oily residescence. Rebecca Whitmore was found in her wedding dress, sitting motionless in a chair at the front of the room, her eyes vacant and her hands folded in her lap. She appeared unharmed physically, but when the guests spoke to her, she responded only with a hollow stare and occasional muttering in what sounded like Latin phrases. Dr. Marcus Fleming, the county physician who was summoned to examine Rebecca, noted in his official report dated November 17, 1902, that the young woman exhibited symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. Her pulse was abnormally slow, her skin temperature several degrees below normal, and she seemed unable to recognize familiar faces or respond to simple commands. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Fleming observed, were the strange markings that appeared to have been carved into the wooden floorboards around her chair, forming intricate geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Benjamin Whitmore was discovered in his bedroom upstairs, alive but in a state of complete catatonia. According to the medical examination records housed in the Alabama Department of Public Health Archives, the farmer's hair had turned completely white overnight, and his hands bore dozens of small puncture wounds that appeared to have been made by sewing needles. Sheriff Coleman Patterson, who led the initial investigation, noted that Whitmore's bedroom door had been locked from the inside, and that the key was found clutched so tightly in the man's fist that they had to break 2 of his fingers to retrieve it. But it was the absence of the 3 elder sisters that truly mystified investigators. Martha, Evangeline, and Prudence Whitmore had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their everyday clothes folded neatly on their beds, and a series of journals that would not be fully translated until decades later. Pastor Thornfield was nowhere to be found, though his Bible was discovered in the kitchen fireplace, partially burned and covered in what laboratory analysis would later identify as human blood. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about the Whitmore sisters that had somehow escaped the notice of their rural neighbors. Mrs. Sarah Holloway, who lived on the adjacent farm, told Sheriff Patterson that she had often seen strange lights emanating from the Whitmore property late at night, particularly during the new moon. She had assumed they were conducting extended prayer meetings, given their reputation for religious devotion, but now recalled that the lights had an unnatural greenish tint that made her livestock restless and agitated. James Corbett, the local blacksmith who had recently completed some repair work on the Whitmore property, provided even more troubling testimony. According to the deposition preserved in the Crenshaw County Courthouse records, Corbett had discovered what appeared to be an underground chamber beneath the family's root cellar. The sisters had claimed it was simply additional storage space for preserves, but Corbett noted that the walls bore carved symbols similar to those found in the parlor, and that the air in the chamber carried a sweet, cloying scent that made him feel dizzy and nauseous. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation revealed that Pastor Thornfield was not the first religious figure to disappear in connection with the Whitmore family. Church records from the Montgomery Diocese, discovered by historian Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell in 1967, indicated that 2 previous ministers had simply vanished after conducting services at the Whitmore farm. Reverend Thomas Ashford had disappeared in March of 1899 while delivering last rites to the sisters' ailing aunt, and Father Michael O'Brien had vanished in September of 1901 after agreeing to bless their harvest. In both cases, the disappearances had been attributed to the men simply moving on to other parishes, but Dr. Hartwell's research revealed that neither man had ever taken up new positions, nor had they contacted their families again. The journals left behind by the sisters, written in a mixture of English, Latin, and what appeared to be an unknown symbolic language, provided the most chilling evidence of their activities. Professor David Worthington of the University of Alabama, who studied the documents extensively in the 1970s, managed to translate several key passages that suggested the sisters had been practicing a form of ritualistic devotion that bore little resemblance to any recognized Christian denomination. One entry, dated October 3, 1902, contained Martha Whitmore's reflection on what she termed the necessary preparation of sacred vessels for the harvest of souls. According to Professor Worthington's translation, published in the Alabama Historical Quarterly in 1974, the sisters believed they were engaged in a divine mission to purify religious leaders through elaborate ceremonies that would supposedly elevate both the participants and their subjects to a higher spiritual plane. The journals described in graphic detail how previous ceremonies had been conducted, involving the systematic removal of what the sisters called corrupted flesh and the preservation of sanctified remains in specially prepared containers hidden throughout their property. Sheriff Patterson's investigation took a disturbing turn when his deputies began excavating the Whitmore property based on information found in the journals. On December 2, 1902, they discovered the first of what would eventually be identified as 17 separate burial sites scattered across the farm's 40-acre plot. The remains were in various states of preservation, with some appearing to be several years old, while others seemed much more recent. Most troubling of all, many of the bodies showed signs of having been systematically dismembered while still alive, with surgical precision that suggested extensive anatomical knowledge. Dr. Fleming's forensic examination, conducted with the assistance of specialists brought in from Birmingham, revealed that the victims had been subjected to procedures that defied medical explanation. Several bodies bore evidence of having been drained of blood through carefully placed incisions, while others showed signs of organ removal performed with instruments that left distinctive cutting patterns. Most disturbing of all, 3 of the more recent remains appeared to have been preserved through some unknown chemical process that kept the flesh supple and lifelike despite obvious post-mortem changes. The community's shock deepened when investigators realized that many of the victims could be identified as traveling ministers, circuit riders, and other religious figures who had passed through the area over the previous decade. The Montgomery Advertiser's coverage from December 1902, preserved in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, described how families from across the state came forward to identify missing relatives among the recovered remains. The victims ranged in age from 23 to 67, and all showed evidence of having been held captive for extended periods before their deaths. As the investigation progressed, disturbing details emerged about the sisters' methods and motivations. Testimony from Rebecca Whitmore, who gradually regained some capacity for speech under Dr. Fleming's care, suggested that the sisters had developed an elaborate theology based on their interpretation of biblical passages regarding sacrifice and purification. According to Rebecca's fragmentary recollections, recorded in medical notes from January 1903, her sisters believed that by subjecting religious leaders to ritual torture and death, they were enabling these men to achieve a form of martyrdom that would guarantee their immediate ascension to heaven. The sisters had apparently spent years perfecting their techniques, studying medical texts obtained through mail-order catalogues, and experimenting with various preservation methods learned from their deceased mother's work as an unofficial mortician for the local community. Their journals contained detailed anatomical drawings and meticulous records of each victim's responses to different procedures, suggesting a level of systematic documentation that horrified even experienced investigators. Sheriff Patterson's reports, housed in the Alabama State Archives, describe how the investigation revealed an extensive network of underground chambers and hidden rooms throughout the Whitmore property. The sisters had spent years excavating and reinforcing these spaces, creating what amounted to a sophisticated laboratory for their gruesome activities. The chambers contained not only surgical instruments and preservation chemicals, but also extensive libraries of religious texts, medical journals, and handwritten treatises on what the sisters termed sacred anatomy. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Pastor Thornfield's remains in a specially prepared chamber directly beneath the parlor where the wedding was to have taken place. Unlike the other victims who had been buried in various locations around the property, the pastor's body had been carefully preserved and arranged in a ceremonial position surrounded by candles and religious artifacts. According to the investigation records, his body showed evidence of having been subjected to the most elaborate and prolonged procedures yet discovered, suggesting that the sisters had planned his death as the culmination of their ritual activities. The question of what had become of Martha, Evangeline, and Prudence Whitmore remained a central mystery throughout the investigation. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding countryside and inquiries sent to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast, no trace of the sisters was ever found. Their disappearance became even more puzzling when investigators discovered that the family's modest savings account had been emptied several weeks before Pastor Thornfield's arrival, suggesting that the sisters had planned their escape well in advance. However, disturbing reports began to surface from neighboring counties suggesting that the sisters' activities might be continuing elsewhere. In February 1903, 2 ministers disappeared under suspicious circumstances in Coffee County, approximately 60 miles southeast of the Whitmore farm. The circumstances bore striking similarities to the earlier disappearances, including reports of strange lights and unexplained sounds coming from remote farmhouses. When local authorities investigated, they found evidence of underground chambers and ritual markings identical to those discovered at the Whitmore property. Similar incidents continued to be reported throughout the early decades of the 20th century, always following the same pattern of religious figures disappearing after being invited to conduct services at isolated rural properties. The reports came from locations scattered across Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, suggesting that the sisters had continued their activities while moving from place to place to avoid detection. In each case, investigators found evidence of the same elaborate ritual preparations and systematic documentation that had characterized the original Whitmore murders. The case took on new dimensions in 1923 when Dr. Angela Morrison, a professor of criminology at Emory University, began conducting interviews with surviving witnesses and family members of the victims. Her research, published in the Journal of Southern Criminal History in 1925, revealed that many of the victims had received similar invitations to conduct special services at remote locations, always from families claiming to be in desperate need of spiritual guidance. The invitations were typically delivered by well-dressed women who claimed to represent farming families too poor and isolated to support a regular minister. Dr. Morrison's investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that the Whitmore sisters had been part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar activities. Church records from multiple denominations contained references to unusual requests for visiting ministers, often submitted by women claiming to represent communities that subsequent investigation revealed did not exist. The pattern suggested a level of coordination and planning that extended far beyond what three isolated farm women could have accomplished on their own. The mystery deepened further when Dr. Morrison discovered that several of the families who had reported missing ministers had themselves disappeared shortly after providing testimony to local authorities. Entire households would simply vanish overnight, leaving behind only empty houses and scattered personal belongings. The disappearances always occurred during new moon periods, and neighbors invariably reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual sounds in the days preceding each incident. By the 1930s, reports of similar disappearances had become so numerous that several southern law enforcement agencies established informal communication networks to share information about missing religious figures. Detective Raymond Kowalski of the Birmingham Police Department, who coordinated much of this effort, estimated in his 1934 annual report that over 100 ministers, missionaries, and other religious workers had vanished under suspicious circumstances since the original Whitmore case. The actual number was likely much higher, as many disappearances in remote rural areas went unreported or were attributed to natural causes. The case continues to baffle investigators to this day. If you encounter three well-dressed sisters offering spiritual services in isolated rural areas, particularly during new moon periods, do not engage with them under any circumstances. Report the sighting immediately to local authorities and warn others in your community. Some hungers, it seems, are never satisfied, and some evils never truly die. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in rural Alabama at the dawn of the 20th century. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this investigation as disturbing as I have over the years of research that led to these revelations. In the autumn of 1902, the cotton fields of Crenshaw County, Alabama, stretched endlessly under an unforgiving sun. The Whitmore farm sat isolated, 23 miles from the nearest settlement of Pineapple, connected only by dirt roads that became impassable during heavy rains. It was here that the wedding of Sarah Catherine Whitmore was to take place on October 13, 1902, a date that would become synonymous with horror in local folklore. What happened to Pastor Edmund Thorne at the hands of Sarah's three sisters would challenge everything we understand about human nature and leave questions that remain unanswered to this day. The Whitmore family had settled in the region in 1887, purchasing 460 acres of prime cotton land from the estate of a Confederate veteran. According to records preserved in the Alabama State Archives, the family consisted of patriarch William Whitmore, age 54, his wife Margaret, 49, and their four daughters, Elizabeth, 26, Mary Catherine, 24, Sarah Catherine, 22, and Ruth, 19. The family was known throughout the county for their strict Methodist faith and their prosperity, which had grown considerably during the agricultural boom of the 1890s. Pastor Edmund Thorne, 38 years old, had arrived in Crenshaw County in the spring of 1901, assigned to serve the scattered Methodist congregations across 3 counties. Documents from the Methodist Conference archives in Birmingham show that Thorne was a widower from North Carolina, described by his superiors as devoted to his calling, and uncommonly gifted in matters of spiritual guidance. What these records do not reveal is the darker truth about Pastor Thorne's past, information that would only surface decades later through the meticulous research of Dr. Harrison Mitchell of Auburn University. The wedding was planned as a grand affair by local standards. Sarah Catherine was to marry James Holbrook, the son of a neighboring landowner whose family controlled significant timber interests in the region. The guest list, preserved in Margaret Whitmore's personal correspondence found in the County Historical Society, included over 60 families from across the region. Pastor Thorne had conducted the wedding preparations with his characteristic attention to detail, visiting the Whitmore farm weekly throughout the summer and early autumn of 1902. On the morning of October 13, 1902, Pastor Thorne arrived at the Whitmore farm at precisely 8 o'clock, as recorded in the testimony given later to Sheriff Thomas Caldwell. The weather was unusually warm for mid-October, with temperatures reaching near 80 degrees by midday. The last confirmed sighting of Pastor Thorne alive was at approximately 10:30 a.m., when hired hand Joshua Freeman observed him walking toward the main house, carrying his Bible and ceremonial vestments. What transpired in the hours that followed would only be reconstructed through fragmentary testimonies, bloodstains, and physical evidence that defied rational explanation. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Caldwell on October 20, 1902, the three Whitmore sisters claimed they had discovered Pastor Thorne's body in the root cellar beneath the main house at approximately 2:00 p.m., just 2 hours before the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. The condition of the body, as described in Dr. Samuel Morrison's autopsy report dated October 15, 1902, was unlike anything the county physician had encountered in his 23 years of practice. Pastor Thorne had been systematically mutilated with surgical precision, his body bearing 37 distinct wounds, inflicted with what Dr. Morrison described as implements both sharp and blunt, applied with considerable anatomical knowledge. Most disturbing was the discovery that several organs had been removed with such skill that Dr. Morrison initially suspected the work of a trained physician. The three sisters provided conflicting accounts of their discovery. Elizabeth, the eldest, claimed in her initial statement to Sheriff Caldwell that she had gone to the cellar to retrieve preserves for the wedding feast when she stumbled upon the body. However, her dress, which was retained as evidence, bore extensive bloodstains that suggested prolonged contact with the victim. Mary Catherine initially denied entering the cellar at all, but later admitted she had followed her sister down the wooden steps. Ruth, the youngest, became catatonic when questioned and would not speak for 6 days following the incident. The wedding guests, who had begun arriving by noon, were initially told that Pastor Thorne had been taken ill. However, when Sheriff Caldwell arrived at 3:15 p.m. in response to a message sent by William Whitmore, the truth could no longer be concealed. According to witness statements collected by Deputy Marcus Webb, several guests reported hearing unnatural sounds coming from beneath the house throughout the morning hours, which they had attributed to livestock or farm machinery. Physical evidence at the scene presented numerous inconsistencies that troubled investigators. The root cellar showed signs of extensive preparation, with ropes, metal implements, and what Dr. Morrison described as ritualistic arrangements of candles and personal effects. Most puzzling was the discovery of a journal, written in Pastor Thorne's handwriting, found clutched in his left hand, containing detailed confessions to crimes that had occurred in 3 different states over the previous 15 years. The journal, examined by handwriting expert Professor Adelaide Townsend of the Birmingham Female College, revealed a pattern of abuse targeting young women in remote religious communities. According to Professor Townsend's analysis, completed in December 1902, the handwriting was genuine, but the circumstances of its creation remained highly irregular and suggestive of duress or altered mental state. Sheriff Caldwell's investigation revealed that the 3 Whitmore sisters had received information about Pastor Thorne's history through correspondence with religious authorities in North Carolina. Letters discovered in Elizabeth's personal effects, dated throughout September 1902, detailed accusations made against Thorne by members of his previous congregation, accusations that had been suppressed by church leadership to avoid scandal. The sisters' motive became clearer as the investigation progressed. According to testimony from neighboring families, Pastor Thorne had shown inappropriate interest in Ruth, the youngest Whitmore daughter, during his weekly visits to the farm. Sarah Holbrook, formerly Sarah Catherine Whitmore, admitted under questioning that her sisters had confronted the pastor about his behavior, but she maintained ignorance of any plans for violence. The trial of the 3 Whitmore sisters began on February 15, 1903, in the Circuit Court of Crenshaw County. Judge Harrison Pemberton presided over proceedings that would last 3 weeks and generate newspaper coverage throughout Alabama and neighboring states. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Morrison, argued that the sisters had planned and executed the murder with premeditation, using information about Pastor Thorne's past as justification for taking the law into their own hands. The defense strategy, orchestrated by attorney Robert Fitzgerald, centered on the claim that Pastor Thorne's death had been the result of divine intervention. Fitzgerald presented testimony from religious scholars who argued that the precise nature of the wounds and the circumstances of death suggested supernatural forces at work. This argument was supported by the testimony of 3 independent witnesses who claimed to have experienced prophetic dreams about Pastor Thorne's fate in the weeks leading up to October 13th. Dr. Elias Worthington, a professor of theology at Birmingham Southern College, testified that the positioning of the body and the arrangement of objects in the root cellar corresponded to descriptions of divine judgment found in apocryphal religious texts. Dr. Worthington's testimony, preserved in the court transcripts housed at the Alabama Department of Archives, suggested that the sisters may have been acting as instruments of divine will rather than autonomous agents of murder. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The reduced charges reflected what jury foreman Thomas Ashcraft later described as reasonable doubt about the full extent of human agency in the pastor's demise. Elizabeth Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in prison, Mary Catherine to 12 years, and Ruth to 10 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 2/3 of their sentences. The case might have ended there, relegated to local history and occasional mention in legal texts, if not for the research conducted by Dr. Harrison Mitchell, beginning in 1967. Dr. Mitchell, a professor of criminology at Auburn University, became interested in the Whitmore case while researching patterns of religious violence in the rural South. His investigation, supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, would uncover evidence that cast the 1902 events in an entirely different light. Dr. Mitchell's first breakthrough came through his examination of prison records from the Alabama State Penitentiary in Wetumpka. According to documents he obtained in 1969, all 3 Whitmore sisters had exhibited unusual behavior during their incarceration. Elizabeth had spent increasing amounts of time in isolation after guards reported her ability to predict events within the prison with uncanny accuracy. Mary Catherine had been transferred between 3 different facilities due to what administrators described as disruptive influence on other inmates. Ruth had been released after serving only 4 years when prison physicians declared her permanently altered in mental capacity. More disturbing were Dr. Mitchell's discoveries about what happened to the sisters after their release. Elizabeth had died in 1923 under circumstances that local authorities in Montgomery had ruled accidental, though witness statements suggested she had predicted her own death to the hour. Mary Catherine had disappeared entirely in 1925, with her last known address being a boarding house in Mobile that had burned down 3 days after her departure. Ruth had returned to the abandoned Whitmore farm, where she lived alone until her death in 1954. Dr. Mitchell's examination of Ruth's personal effects, donated to the County Historical Society by her estate, revealed a collection of journals documenting supernatural experiences that had persisted throughout her life. According to entries dating from 1920 to 1954, Ruth claimed to maintain contact with Pastor Thorne's spirit, which she described as seeking forgiveness for his earthly crimes, while warning of similar predators operating in religious communities across the region. The journals contained detailed descriptions of 11 men whom Ruth identified as clergymen engaged in abuse of their positions. Dr. Mitchell's follow-up research, conducted between 1971 and 1974, confirmed that 7 of these men had indeed been investigated for improper conduct, though none had faced criminal charges. Most remarkable were Ruth's entries from 1948, which described in detail the crimes of Father Michael O'Connor of the Catholic Diocese in Birmingham, 5 years before O'Connor's arrest and conviction for child abuse. Dr. Mitchell's investigation took a troubling turn in 1975 when he gained access to the original crime scene. The Whitmore farm had remained abandoned since Ruth's death, with ownership reverting to the county due to unpaid taxes. Dr. Mitchell's excavation of the root cellar, conducted with the assistance of archaeology graduate students from Auburn, uncovered physical evidence that had been overlooked during the 1902 investigation. Beneath the earthen floor of the cellar, Dr. Mitchell's team discovered a cavity containing what appeared to be ritual implements dating from the pre-Civil War period. Carbon dating analysis conducted at the University of Georgia confirmed that several wooden items found in the cavity were at least 80 years older than the 1902 murder, suggesting a history of unusual activity at the location extending back to the 1820s or earlier. Most significant was the discovery of human remains buried beneath the cellar floor. Forensic analysis conducted by Dr. Sarah Hensley of the Alabama State Crime Laboratory identified the remains as belonging to at least 3 individuals, all adult males between the ages of 30 and 50. The condition of the bones suggested violent death, with cut marks consistent with the wounds inflicted on Pastor Thorne 73 years earlier. Dr. Mitchell's research into the early history of the property revealed a pattern of violent deaths involving religious figures dating back to the 1830s. According to records from the Creek Indian Agency, preserved in the National Archives, the land had been the site of conflicts between Methodist missionaries and traditional Creek religious practitioners in the 1820s. 3 missionaries had disappeared in the area between 1828 and 1835, their bodies never recovered. The implications of Dr. Mitchell's discoveries extended far beyond the Whitmore case. His research suggested the existence of what he termed generational justice cycles, in which communities developed systematic methods for identifying and eliminating predatory religious figures. Dr. Mitchell theorized that the Whitmore sisters had been acting within a tradition of extrajudicial punishment that extended back decades and potentially involved other families in the region. Dr. Mitchell's final report, submitted to the university in June 1976, recommended continued investigation and suggested that similar patterns might be identified in other rural communities across the South. However, Dr. Mitchell himself disappeared on July 15, 1976, while conducting field research at the abandoned Whitmore farm. His vehicle was found 3 days later on a dirt road 5 miles from the property, with no sign of struggle or indication of his whereabouts. The Auburn University investigation into Dr. Mitchell's disappearance, led by Professor Daniel Carwood, uncovered troubling inconsistencies in the final weeks of his research. According to his graduate assistant Rebecca Torres, Dr. Mitchell had become increasingly agitated and had spoken repeatedly about active forces at the Whitmore property that resented outside scrutiny. Ms. Torres reported that Dr. Mitchell had received several threatening phone calls from unidentified callers who warned him to abandon his research. Most disturbing was the discovery of Dr. Mitchell's field notes from his final visit to the property. According to these notes, found in his university office, he had encountered 3 women at the abandoned farm who bore striking resemblance to the Whitmore sisters. The women had told him that his research was incomplete and had invited him to return after dark to learn the complete truth. Dr. Mitchell's final entry, dated July 14, 1976, indicated his intention to accept this invitation. The case attracted renewed attention in 1982, when investigative journalist Maria Santos published a series of articles in the Birmingham News examining unsolved disappearances of religious figures across Alabama. Santos's research identified 17 cases between 1903 and 1981 in which clergymen, missionaries, or religious teachers had vanished under circumstances similar to Dr. Mitchell's disappearance. In each case, the missing person had been conducting research or pastoral work in rural communities with histories of religious conflict. Santos's investigation revealed patterns that suggested coordinated activity among multiple communities. According to her analysis, the disappearances clustered around specific geographic areas and occurred most frequently during October, the same month as Pastor Thorne's murder. Most significantly, Santos documented testimonies from 12 different sources claiming to have encountered the Whitmore sisters at locations throughout Alabama, despite the fact that all 3 women had died decades earlier. Modern technology has provided additional disturbing evidence about ongoing activity related to the Whitmore case. In 1995, Alabama State Trooper Kevin Morrison, investigating reports of trespassing at the abandoned farm, captured audio recordings of female voices speaking in what linguist Dr. Patricia Williamson identified as archaic Southern dialect, consistent with early 20th century usage. The voices discussed specific details about Pastor Thorne's crimes that had not been made public until Dr. Mitchell's research in the 1970s. Video footage captured by paranormal investigators in 2003 showed shadowy figures moving through the ruins of the Whitmore house during nighttime hours. Analysis of this footage by digital forensics expert Dr. James Park of the University of Alabama confirmed that the images had not been manipulated and showed movement patterns consistent with human figures, though no living persons were present at the location during filming. Most recently, in 2019, construction workers preparing to develop the former Whitmore property discovered additional human remains buried throughout the grounds. Forensic analysis identified these remains as belonging to at least 8 individuals who had died between 1880 and 1920. All showed signs of violent death, and several were found with religious artifacts that suggested clerical status. The discovery prompted a comprehensive investigation by the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, led by Special Agent Catherine Webb. Agent Webb's team identified several of the remains through historical records and confirmed that the individuals had been reported missing during their lifetimes, but never found. The investigation revealed that all had been accused or suspected of inappropriate conduct with members of their congregations, though formal charges had never been filed in most cases. Agent Webb's investigation uncovered evidence of what she described as an organized network of rural communities engaged in systematic elimination of predatory religious figures over a period of nearly a century. This network appeared to operate through informal communication channels that allowed communities to share information about suspicious clergy and coordinate responses when official authorities failed to take action. The investigation also revealed that descendants of families involved in these activities continue to live throughout rural Alabama and maintain what Agent Webb termed ancestral obligations to monitor religious figures in their communities. Several individuals questioned during the investigation admitted to maintaining surveillance of current clergy and expressed willingness to take necessary action if suspicious behavior was identified. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that this network had adapted to modern technology and expanded its operations beyond Alabama. Digital forensics analysis revealed online communications among individuals in 12 states who shared information about clergy under investigation for abuse and coordinated efforts to ensure appropriate consequences when legal systems failed to provide justice. The Whitmore case represents far more than a single incident of vigilante justice from over a century ago. It reveals the existence of a parallel system of accountability that has operated in the shadows of American society for generations, targeting those who abuse positions of religious authority. While the methods employed by this network are undeniably criminal, the effectiveness of their approach in eliminating predators who might otherwise continue harming victims cannot be ignored. The moral complexity of the Whitmore legacy challenges our understanding of justice and community responsibility. The 3 sisters who murdered Pastor Thorne were undoubtedly guilty of crimes that warranted punishment, yet their actions prevented unknown numbers of future victims from suffering abuse. The network that appears to have evolved from their example operates outside legal boundaries, but serves a function that official institutions have historically failed to fulfill adequately. Modern readers must grapple with the uncomfortable reality that Pastor Thorne's death, horrific as it was, may have saved lives. The journal found in his possession detailed crimes against at least 23 young women across 3 states, crimes that would likely have continued if not for the intervention of the Whitmore sisters. The systematic nature of his predatory behavior, combined with the protection he received from religious authorities, suggests that legal remedies would have been insufficient to stop his activities. The persistence of the network, established in response to such failures of justice, indicates that communities continue to face similar challenges today. While modern legal systems provide more robust mechanisms for addressing clerical abuse than existed in 1902, the recent scandals involving multiple religious organizations demonstrate that institutional protection of predators remains a significant problem. The supernatural elements associated with the Whitmore case, while difficult to verify scientifically, serve an important function in maintaining the network's effectiveness. The belief that the original sisters continue to monitor and guide the network's activities provides psychological reinforcement for participants and creates a deterrent effect among potential targets. Whether these supernatural encounters represent genuine paranormal phenomena or collective psychological responses to trauma and injustice is ultimately less important than their practical impact. As we conclude this examination of one of Alabama's darkest and most complex criminal cases, we must acknowledge that the questions it raises have no easy answers. The Whitmore sisters committed murder, but their actions arose from a community's desperate attempt to protect its most vulnerable members from a predator who enjoyed institutional protection. The network that evolved from their example operates through criminal means, but serves victims who have been failed by legitimate authorities. The legacy of October 13, 1902, continues to influence events throughout the rural South today. Those who would abuse positions of religious trust in isolated communities do so knowing that their actions may trigger responses that extend far beyond legal consequences. The Whitmore sisters' example has created a form of community accountability that persists across generations, adapting to new technologies and evolving threats while maintaining its fundamental purpose of protecting potential victims from predatory clergy. One pastor entered the Whitmore farm on October 13, 1902, carrying secrets that would have destroyed countless lives. He never left. The three sisters who ensured his silence may still be watching from the shadows, and their network of descendants and spiritual successors continues their work across the American South. For those who would follow Pastor Thorne's example, this serves as a warning that some communities have found their own methods of ensuring justice, methods that operate beyond the reach of courts and law enforcement, methods that have proven remarkably effective for over a century.